She tried to evict me from my own $42 million estate. She walked into my house like I didn't belong there, and everyone else believed her. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just let it play out, because I knew something they didn't. And when the deputies finally checked the deed, everything changed. If you want to see how quiet truth shuts down loud lies, stay with me and consider subscribing for more stories like this. The morning started the way most mornings do out here, quiet enough that you can hear your own footsteps echo back at you. Greyhaven sits on the eastern slope above a long stretch of pine and scrub, the kind of land where the wind doesn't rush. It just moves steady, like it's got somewhere to be but no reason to hurry. I had the front doors open to let that air roll through the foyer, carrying dust off the stone driveway and into the marble entry where sunlight cut across the floor in clean lines. I was in the library when it happened. Old walnut shelves, original to the house. You could still smell the oil in the wood if you ran your hand across it. I had a cloth in one hand, working along the edge of a cabinet, and in the other, a rolled architectural drawing I'd found in a storage trunk, dated 1927, stamped with the original builder's mark. That was the kind of thing that mattered to me. Not resale value, not headlines, craft. That's why I bought Greyhaven. I was halfway through unrolling the paper when I heard it. Heels. Not outside. Not on gravel. Inside. Sharp, deliberate clicks moving across the marble foyer like someone had already decided they belonged there. I didn't rush. Didn't drop what I was holding. Just set the drawing down on the table and walked toward the doorway between the library and the hall. She appeared a second later. Mid-50s, controlled posture, dressed like she had somewhere important to be. Only she was already acting like she'd arrived. Behind her were two others, clipboard types, the kind that look around a place not to admire it, but to measure it. She didn't hesitate when she saw me, didn't ask who I was, didn't even slow down. She just stepped fully into the room, glanced once at the shelves, once at the ceiling, then fixed her eyes on me like I was the problem that needed solving. "Sir," she said, voice clean, practiced. "HOA event begins in 30 minutes. You'll need to leave." For a second, I honestly thought I'd misheard her. Or maybe she was joking. Some kind of local misunderstanding that would clear itself up with one sentence. So I gave her the benefit of that second. "Leave what?" I asked. She blinked, just once. Not confused, more like surprised I'd asked. "Greyhaven," she said, like that should have been obvious. And there it was. Not hesitation, not uncertainty. Confidence. The kind you get when you've said something enough times that it starts to sound like truth, even if it never was. I nodded once and leaned a hand against the edge of the table, not in defense, just steady. Interesting. That was all I gave her. No raised voice, no correction, no explanation about deeds or closing documents or the 6 weeks I'd already spent reviewing every inch of this property before signing anything. Because there's something I learned a long time ago. When someone's already digging a hole, you don't stop them. You hand them a bigger shovel. Victoria Hargrove didn't introduce herself right away. She didn't need to. The way the two behind her watched her for cues told me everything I needed to know about where the authority sat. She turned slightly, gesturing back toward the foyer. "Guests will begin arriving shortly," she continued. "We've reserved the main hall, the ballroom, and the greenhouse for today's event. Security will be on site as well." Reserved. That word hung there a little longer than the rest. I followed her gesture out into the foyer. Through the open front doors, I could see movement on the driveway. White vans, a box truck, a couple of SUVs pulling up in sequence like they'd rehearsed it. People were already unloading crates, racks, folding tables. No hesitation, no checking in, just operation. I stepped past her and into the entryway, watching a man in a catering uniform carry a stack of trays straight through my front door like it had been his job for years. "Who authorized this?" I asked, not turning back yet. Victoria's heels clicked once more as she came up beside me. "The Kingsley Ridge Board," she said, "as they always have." Always. Another word that sounded simple until you realized how much weight it was carrying. I finally looked at her. Up close, her expression didn't change. Same steady confidence, same slight lift at the corner of her mouth like she was already past the point of needing to prove anything. "You might want to gather your things," she added. "We'll need the space clear." Gather your things. In my own house. I let that sit for a second. Let the sound of the trucks outside, the movement in the foyer, the quiet assumption in her voice all line up exactly the way they were meant to. Then I walked back into the library without another word. Not retreating, not conceding, just moving. I picked up my phone from the table, unlocked it, and opened a new email. To Rachel Mercer. Subject line: She entered again today. I didn't type anything else. Just attached 3 still frames from the interior cameras I'd installed the week after closing. Time-stamped. Clear angles of the foyer, the hallway, the library entrance. Victoria stepping in without hesitation. I hit send. Behind me, I could hear her giving instructions now. Directing someone toward the ballroom. Asking about floral placement. Talking about guest flow like she'd done it 100 times before. Maybe she had. That was the part that mattered. I stepped back into the foyer and watched as another group walked in carrying display stands. Polished metal frames, likely for signage or donor boards. One of them nodded at me as he passed. "Morning," he said, like we were co-workers sharing a space. I nodded back. "Morning?" No confrontation. Not yet. Instead, I pulled up the non-emergency number for the sheriff's office and stepped just outside the front doors where the wind cut across the stone steps. "Dispatch," a voice answered. "Yeah," I said, keeping it even. "This is Dorian Whitlock out at Greyhaven Estate. I've got a developing property dispute. No immediate danger, but I'd like it logged." They asked a few standard questions. I gave them simple answers. Names where I had them. Description of what was happening. No dramatics. Because this wasn't the kind of situation that got solved by volume. This was the kind that got solved by records. When I hung up, I stood there for a moment, looking out across the drive. More vehicles now. More people. The operation was building. Inside, Victoria Hargrove was already acting like she'd won something. And maybe, in her version of the story, she had. But stories have a way of holding together right up until the moment someone checks them against the record. I turned back toward the open doors, watching another vendor disappear into the house without slowing down. No one was asking permission. No one was checking ownership. They were following something else entirely. A version of the truth that had been repeated long enough to feel real. I stepped inside, letting the door stay open behind me, and listened to the sound of my own floor under my boots as I crossed the foyer again. If she believed this place was hers to control, if all of them did, then the real question wasn't whether she was wrong. The real question was how far she'd go before someone forced her to prove it. And more importantly, how many people had already decided not to look too closely. Because one thing was already clear. Victoria Hargrove wasn't guessing. She was certain. Which meant somewhere along the line, this $42 million estate had stopped being a property and turned into a story. And nobody in this house, except me, had bothered to check if that story was actually true. By the time the second catering truck rolled in, the pattern was already clear. This wasn't chaos. It was coordination. 2 men in black polos unloaded stainless racks and wheeled them straight past the foyer without slowing down. A woman with a clipboard followed behind them, reading off something under her breath, then stopped just long enough to ask one of Victoria's board members where the service corridor was located. Service corridor. Like it had always been here for them. I stepped closer, not to interrupt, just to listen. Ballroom set up in 20, she said. Florals need placement confirmation before guests arrive. The board member nodded like they'd rehearsed this conversation. Same layout as last fall, he replied. Victoria approved it. Last fall. That caught my attention. I watched them disappear down the hall, then turned back toward the front steps where another vehicle had just pulled up. A small van with a local print company logo stamped on the seat. The driver stepped out carrying a stack of signs. Not temporary paper flyers. Mounted boards. Polished. Branded. He walked right past me, gave a quick nod like we were on the same team, and headed inside. I followed this time. Not fast. Not aggressive. Just enough to see where those signs were going. He stopped in the foyer, leaned one against the wall, and peeled back the protective wrap. Welcome to the Greyhaven Community Heritage Center. The lettering was clean, professional, expensive, not something you print overnight. I glanced at the bottom corner. Kingsley Ridge Association. There it was. Not implied. Not suggested. Printed. I reached out and ran a thumb along the edge of the board, then stepped back. How long have you been doing these, Joe? I asked. The driver looked up, surprised I'd spoken. Oh, for the HOA? He said. Couple years now, on and off. Big events, mostly. Couple years. Always here? I asked. Yeah, he said, like there was no question about it. Greyhaven's kind of their main venue. Main venue. I nodded once like that made sense even though it didn't. Appreciate it, I said. He gave a small shrug and went back to unpacking. I walked past him and into the hallway leading toward the ballroom. Voices echoed ahead, light, conversational, comfortable. Inside, a florist crew was already setting arrangements along the windows. Tall stems, white and green, positioned with the kind of care you don't waste on a one-time setup. One of them stepped back, tilted her head, and adjusted a vase by half an inch. Looks better, she said. Another nodded. Victoria'll like that. I stayed in the doorway. How'd you get booked for this? I asked. She glanced over, wiping her hands on a cloth. Through the HOA, she said. Same as always. We've done 3 events here already this year. 3 events, this year. I let that settle for a second. And nobody contacted the property owner? I asked. She frowned slightly, like the question didn't track. The HOA handles all that, she said. We just show up where they tell us. Of course they did. I gave her a nod and stepped back out into the hall. By the time I reached the foyer again, there were more signs up. Directional arrows, event schedules, a printed welcome board listing sponsors and donors. Everything about it said legitimacy, structure, ownership, and none of it had come from me. I pulled my phone out and started taking photos. Every sign, every logo, every piece of printed material I could see. Then I zoomed in on the smaller details. Email addresses, phone numbers, website links tucked into the corners. One of them stood out. Greyhaven. Heritage.org. I opened it. The homepage loaded clean, fast, professionally designed. Front and center was a photo of this house, taken from the front drive, late afternoon light, shadows long across the stone. Underneath it, a headline, Preserving Community History at Greyhaven Estate. I scrolled. Event listings, reservation forms, donation links, all tied back to Kingsley Ridge. No mention of ownership, no mention of any transfer. Just language. Carefully chosen language, community landmark, shared heritage, local asset. Not one of those words meant ownership, but together, they felt like it. I took screenshots of every page, saved them, archived them, because websites change, records don't. Behind me, I heard Victoria's voice again, confident, steady. Donor reception starts at 6, she was saying. We'll open the greenhouse at 7 for tours. I turned slowly. She was standing near the base of the staircase, speaking to a small group, board members, maybe a couple of local sponsors. She caught my eye mid-sentence and didn't miss a beat, didn't hesitate, didn't even acknowledge that I hadn't left. She just kept talking, because in her version of the story, I wasn't part of it. That told me more than anything she could have said out loud. I stepped back toward the front doors and watched as another vendor checked in with one of the board members, handed over paperwork, and got waved inside. Paperwork. That was the next piece. I waited until he passed, then caught up with him just outside the entry. Mind if I see that? I asked, nodding toward the folder in his hand. He hesitated, just for a second, then opened it. Printed emails, schedule confirmations, a PDF attachment labeled Board Authorization, Greyhaven Use. I didn't touch it, just read what I could. The letterhead was clean. Kingsley Ridge Association. Signatures at the bottom. Official looking, convincing. But I knew what I wasn't seeing. No deed reference, no ownership record, no legal description of the property. Just authorization from people who didn't own it. Appreciate it, I said, stepping back. He nodded and headed inside. I stood there for a moment, looking out across the drive as another car pulled in. People weren't trespassing. They were following instructions. That made it cleaner, simpler, and a lot more dangerous. Because if enough people believe something belongs to them, they stop asking permission. I turned back toward the house and stepped inside again, closing the door behind me this time. The noise from inside had grown. More voices. More movement. More certainty. And at the center of it all, Victoria Hargrove moved like she'd never once questioned whether she had the right. I walked back into the library and picked up the architectural drawing I'd set down earlier. Unrolled it the rest of the way. Original plans, stamped, dated, signed. Proof of where this place started. Real proof. I laid it flat on the table and set my phone beside it, the screen still open to the HOA website. 2 versions of the same place. One built on records, the other built on repetition. And right now, repetition was winning. I looked back toward the doorway, listening to the movement echo through the halls. They weren't slowing down. They weren't hesitating, which meant one thing. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was momentum. And the only question left was whether they'd stop on their own or keep going until something forced them to. Because if they kept going, if they kept scheduling, advertising, collecting, then sooner or later, this wasn't going to stay a quiet disagreement inside a house. It was going to turn into something bigger, something public, something that couldn't be explained away with brochures and confident language. I picked up my phone again and opened the email thread with Rachel. No reply yet. Didn't matter. I added a second message. They're still setting up. Looks organized, not accidental. I hit send, then locked the screen and set the phone down. Out in the hallway, someone laughed. Glasses clinked. The event was already starting to feel real. And that was the problem. Because the more real it felt, the harder it would hit when someone finally asked the one question nobody here seemed interested in answering. Who actually owns this place? And what happens when the answer doesn't match the story everyone's been telling? By mid-afternoon, the house wasn't quiet anymore. It was operational, not chaotic, structured, People moving with purpose, calling out times, confirming layouts, adjusting placements like they'd done it here a dozen times before. Every room I walked through had already been assigned a function. Ballroom, dining setup, greenhouse, tour access, library, private donor lounge, my library. I stepped inside just as two men in catering uniforms carried in a polished oak serving table and set it down where I'd been reviewing documents less than an hour earlier. One of them pulled out a tape measure, checking spacing from the wall. "Need 3 feet clearance," he said. The other nodded. That's what they had last time. Last time. I didn't correct them. Instead, I walked closer, slow enough not to startle them, and let them finish measuring before I spoke. "Who told you to use this room?" I asked. They looked up, both of them pausing like they were trying to place me. "HOA coordinator," one said. "Same instructions as last event." "What event?" He shrugged. "Fall fundraiser. Maybe October?" October. That was before I closed on the property. Meaning whatever they were remembering, whatever last time was, it wasn't recent. And nobody had told them that. "Appreciate it," I said. They went back to work. That was the pattern. Nobody arguing. Nobody questioning. Just people doing their jobs based on instructions that felt legitimate. I stepped out into the hall and nearly ran into another vendor, young guy, early 20s, carrying a stack of printed programs. He adjusted his grip and gave me a quick nod. "Where do you want these, Chateau?" he asked. Not where should I put these, where do you want them, like I was part of the process. "Who gave you the order?" I asked. He blinked. "Kingsley Ridge office. Same email as always. Mind if I see it?" He hesitated for half a second, then shifted the programs under one arm and pulled his phone out. Scrolled once, twice, then turned the screen toward me. Subject line: Greyhaven Founders Reception. Final confirmations sender. Events at kingsleyridgehoa.org. Attachment icons below. I scanned it quickly. Timelines, setup instructions, vendor assignments. At the bottom, a line in bold. All access authorized by Kingsley Ridge Board Resolution 18-4B. I looked up. "You've worked here before?" I asked. "Yeah," he said. "Couple times. It's a nice place." Nice place.
Thank you very much.
I handed the phone back. "Thanks," I said. He nodded and headed toward the foyer, already focused on where those programs needed to go. I stood there for a moment, replaying what I'd just seen. Board resolution, authorization, emails, all of it built to look official, but none of it tied to ownership. That was the gap, and nobody here seemed to notice it. I moved toward the greenhouse next. Glass walls, steel frame, the kind of structure that amplifies sound just enough to make quiet conversations feel louder than they are. Inside, an event planner was walking through with a tablet, speaking into a headset. "We'll open this section for tours after 7, she said. "Limit groups to 15. Keep flow moving toward the east path." She stopped when she saw me. "Can I help you?" she asked. Her tone was polite, professional, but there was an edge under it. I stepped inside. "Who scheduled the tours?" I asked. "Kingsley Ridge," she said. "We've been coordinating for weeks. Did anyone from the property approve it?" She frowned slightly, like the question didn't make sense. "The HOA manages the venue," she said. "That's who we work with." Manages the venue. There it was again. Different wording, same assumption. I nodded once. "And if they didn't?" She paused. "Didn't what?" "Didn't have the right to." That was the first time all day someone hesitated. Not long, just enough to register the question. "I don't handle ownership," she said carefully. "I handle logistics." Of course she did. "That's what I figured," I said. I turned and walked back out before she could ask anything else. By the time I reached the main hall again, The place was filling in. Tables set, chairs aligned, floral arrangements placed with precision. Everything looked permanent. That was the problem. Temporary setups don't feel like this. This felt established, like something that had been allowed to continue long enough that nobody questioned it anymore. I stepped outside again, this time walking further down the drive. More vehicles arriving. A black SUV pulled in, slowed near the gate, then rolled forward after a quick glance at the signage posted out front. No guard stopping them. No check-in process tied to me. Just assumption. I walked up to the gate and looked at the temporary banner that had been tied across it. Greyhaven Heritage Reception. Private event. Private. That word again. I pulled my phone out and took another set of photos. Close angles, wide shots, context. Then I stepped back and looked at the property line markers. Small, easy to miss unless you knew where to look. I knew exactly where they were. Every boundary. Every corner. Because I'd walked them myself after closing. No ambiguity, no overlap, no HOA claim anywhere near this structure. I turned back toward the house. Inside, Victoria Hargrove was still moving through the rooms like a conductor, coordinating, adjusting, confirming, and nobody was pushing back. Which meant one thing. Her authority wasn't coming from law. It was coming from repetition, from years of doing this without anyone stopping her, from vendors who kept showing up, from residents who kept attending, from a system that never got corrected. Until now. I walked back inside and into the library again. The serving table was already set, glassware placed, linen folded. The architectural drawing I'd left out earlier had been moved, carefully, but moved, set aside to make room for the setup. I picked it up, rolled it back together, and set it somewhere they wouldn't touch again. Not because it mattered to them, because it mattered to me. Then I pulled my phone out and opened the camera feed. Multiple angles. Foyer, hallway, ballroom entrance, exterior drive. Everything recording. Everything time-stamped. I watched as another vendor walked through the front doors without hesitation. Then another, and another. Each one reinforcing the same idea. This place belongs to the HOA. Not because it's true, because it's been repeated. I lowered the phone and leaned back against the edge of the table. They weren't sneaking in. They weren't forcing access. They were operating in the open. Confident. Organized. Certain. Which made the next part simple. If this kept going, if they kept setting up, running events, collecting money, then eventually someone would have to answer for it. And when that moment came, it wouldn't be about who believed the story. It would be about who could prove it. I pushed off the table and headed back toward the foyer, watching as the last of the setup crews moved into place. Everything ready, everything polished, everything wrong. And nobody, except me, seemed to realize just how far this had already gone. Because the longer they kept using it, the harder it would be to pretend they didn't know. And the question wasn't whether this would turn into a problem. The question was how big that problem was going to be by the time someone finally tried to stop it. I didn't wait for it to get bigger. By late afternoon, I was already on the road. Greyhaven faded behind me in the rearview mirror, still active, still filling up with people who believed they had a right to be there. I let them continue. That was the point. Because the next step wasn't confrontation, it was confirmation. The county recorder's office sat just off the main strip in town, a low building with a faded sign and a door that stuck slightly when you opened it. Inside, everything slowed down. Paper, process, people who didn't move fast because they didn't have to. That's where the truth lived. Daniel Brooks was behind the counter when I walked in, glasses low on his nose, flipping through a stack of filings like he'd been doing it for 30 years. He looked up once. "Afternoon," he said. Need a certified deed, I replied, setting my folder down. Greyhaven Estate. That got his attention. Not surprise, recognition. You're the new owner, he said, already turning toward the back room. Closed 3 weeks ago. He nodded once. Figured we'd see you again. He disappeared into the records area without another word. I waited. No tension here. No debate. Just a system that either confirmed something or didn't. A few minutes later, he came back with a stamped folder and set it on the counter. Certified copy, he said. Recorded, verified. Matches the transfer. I opened it. There it was. Black and white. My name. Legal description. Parcel boundaries. Recording date. No references to Kingsley Ridge. No shared ownership. No conditional access. Just ownership. Anything else tied to it? I asked. Daniel adjusted his glasses and leaned slightly closer. You're asking about encumbrances, he said. Anything that gives someone else a claim. He reached for another file and flipped it open. Title report should have covered this, he said. But let's walk it anyway. He slid a map across the counter, parcel lines marked in clean, precise strokes. This is your property, he said, tapping the main section. House, greenhouse, drive, gardens. Then he moved his finger to a narrow strip along the far edge. This here is a utility easement, less than 30 feet wide. Maintenance access only. I followed the line. That it? That's it. No event use? No. No HOA authority? He gave a short laugh. Not even close. That matched what I already knew. But knowing something and having it certified are two different things. Any historical agreements? I asked. He leaned back slightly. There was a temporary license years ago, he said. Developer ran tours during restoration fundraising, but expired? Automatically terminated at transfer of ownership. There it was. The piece they were building everything around. Not ownership, access, temporary access. And it had ended the moment I signed. You've got a copy of that? I asked. He nodded and pulled another document. Stamped, recorded, clear language. Termination clause spelled out in full. No ambiguity. I read it once, then again, making sure there wasn't a loophole hidden in the wording. There wasn't. They shouldn't be using the property, Daniel said, matter of fact. They are. He didn't look surprised. That happens, he said. People get used to access. Stop checking where it comes from. He tapped the documents lightly. But this doesn't change. No, it didn't. That was the difference. Stories shift. Paper stays. I gathered everything. Certified deed, title summary, parcel map, termination agreement, and slid them into my folder. Appreciate it, I said. Daniel nodded once. If it turns into something bigger, he added, get copies of everything you've got. Photos, notices, communications. Already started. He didn't ask what I meant. Didn't need to. I walked back out into the parking lot and stood there for a moment, the folder in my hand heavier than it looked. Not because of the paper, because of what it meant. Inside Greyhaven, they had momentum. Out here, I had proof, and sooner or later, those two were going to collide. I got back in the truck and headed straight to Rachel Mercer's office. She was already expecting me. When I walked in, she didn't ask how things were going. She just pointed to the conference table. Show me what you've got. I laid everything out. Certified deed first, then the title summary, then the survey, then the termination clause. She didn't interrupt while she read. Didn't react immediately either. Just took her time, line by line, the way someone does when they're not looking for an argument. They're looking for certainty. Finally, she leaned back. They don't have anything, she said. Not on paper. Not anywhere. I nodded. They're still running events. She folded her hands. Then they're relying on something else. Perception, I said. Exactly. She stood up and walked to the window, thinking. How many people are involved? She asked. Dozens already. Vendors, planners, probably donors tonight. And they've been notified? Not yet. She turned back to me. That's the next move. I waited. Certified notice, she said. To everyone involved. Board members, vendors, insurance carriers. Anyone participating in those events. Why all of them? Because once they're informed, she said, everything changes. How? Before notice, they can claim misunderstanding, she said. After notice, they can't. That tracked. If they keep going after that, she continued, it becomes willful. And willful meant liability. Legal, financial, reputational. Everything they were trying to protect. I looked down at the documents spread across the table. This doesn't stop tonight, I said. No, Rachel agreed. It doesn't. Then what does? She met my eyes. Timing. That word again. Same principle as before. Don't stop them too early. Let them commit. Let them build the case for you. She walked back to the table and tapped the deed. This wins, she said. Not your voice, not theirs. This. I nodded slowly, because that was the part Victoria didn't understand. She thought authority came from control, from presence, from people believing her. But none of that mattered when someone finally asked for proof. And now I had it. Certified. Recorded. Unquestionable. I gathered the documents back into the folder and closed it. Back at Greyhaven, the event would be starting soon. Guests arriving, glasses clinking, stories being reinforced. And somewhere inside that house, Victoria Hargrove was still moving like she owned the place. She just didn't know yet. That everything she was building was about to be measured against something that didn't care what she believed, only what she could prove. And for the first time since she walked through my front door, that difference was about to matter. By the time I got back to Greyhaven, the sun was lower, and the house had shifted. It wasn't preparation anymore. It was presentation. Cars lined the drive in a steady row, engines ticking as they cooled. Guests were arriving now, dressed for something formal, stepping out onto my stone driveway like they'd been invited into something permanent. And in their minds, they had. I parked off to the side, far enough not to interrupt the flow, and sat there for a moment watching. People didn't hesitate at the gate. They read the banner, saw the signage, saw the movement, and kept walking. No one stopped to question it. That was the strength of what Victoria had built. Not proof, momentum. I stepped out and walked toward the house, the folder still in my hand. Not visible, not presented, not yet. Inside, the foyer had transformed. Tables dressed in white linen, glassware aligned, printed programs stacked neatly along the entry table, same ones I'd seen earlier. A few guests picked them up, scanning names and schedules like they were part of something established. Beautiful place, one man said to his wife. Can't believe the HOA manages this, she replied. I didn't correct them. I just kept walking. Because this part wasn't about stopping anything. It was about documenting everything. I moved through the rooms slowly, phone in hand, not filming openly, just capturing what mattered. Signs, logos, programs, people, every piece of the story they were building. In the ballroom, a small group had gathered around one of the board members. We've preserved this estate for years, he was saying. It's part of our community identity. Preserved. I made a mental note of that word. Then I took a photo. Across the room, I spotted the same event planner from earlier, now directing staff as trays of drinks were passed out. Everything was smooth, efficient, professional, which made what was coming harder. because none of these people were acting like they were doing anything wrong. That mattered. It meant the responsibility didn't sit with them. It sat higher. I stepped out into the hall and opened my phone again, this time pulling up the list Rachel and I had built. Names, vendors, contacts, insurance carriers tied to the event. Every entity that had been given instructions by Kingsley Ridge. I started checking them off one by one. Each had already received notice, certified, documented, time-stamped. That was the shift. Earlier today, they could claim they didn't know. Now, they'd been told, which meant every step they took after this point counted. I moved toward the side entrance where deliveries had been coming in all afternoon. A man in a security jacket stood there now, mid-40s, solid build, watching the flow of people with quiet attention. He glanced at me as I approached. "Evening," he said. "Evening," I replied. We stood there for a second, both watching as another group entered. "You with the HOA?" he asked. "No," I said. He nodded slowly. "I got a notice earlier," he said, lowering his voice slightly. "Something about ownership dispute." "That's right." He shifted his weight. "They didn't say anything about canceling," he added. "I know." He looked back toward the main hall. "This could get complicated." "It already is," I said. He studied me for a moment, then nodded once. That was the first crack, small, but real. People were starting to notice. Not the story, the inconsistency. I left him there and moved back inside. The house felt fuller now. Voices layered over each other, laughter echoing off the walls, glasses clinking. Everything about it said success, and underneath it, every piece of it was recorded. I stepped into the library. The donor lounge, according to their program. A small group had gathered around the serving table, talking quietly. One of them, a woman in her 60s, looked up as I entered. "Are you with the association?" she asked. "No," I said. She smiled politely, like she didn't quite understand what that meant, then went back to her conversation. That was the problem. Nobody understood. Not because they were ignoring it, because they'd never been told anything different. I walked over to the table and set my folder down for a moment, opening it just enough to check the documents inside. Still there. Still intact. Still quiet. Across the room, someone picked up a program and read aloud. "Welcome to Greyhaven, a cornerstone of Kingsley Ridge heritage." He nodded like it made sense. Because it did, if you believed it. I closed the folder. This wasn't the moment. Not yet. Because one thing Rachel had made clear. Timing matters, and timing meant letting them go far enough that there was no way back. I stepped back out into the hall, just as Victoria came into view again. She was moving through the crowd, shaking hands, greeting donors, thanking people for coming. Polished, confident, untouched by doubt. She caught sight of me near the doorway, paused, just long enough to register that I was still there. Then she smiled, not polite, not uncertain, certain, like she'd already decided how this would end. She walked over, stopping a few feet away. "Mr. Whitlock," she said, voice calm, controlled. "I assumed you'd made arrangements." "I did," I said. Her expression didn't change. "Good," she replied. "Then I trust you understand the importance of not disrupting tonight's event." There it was. Not asking me to leave this time. Telling me not to interfere. Different tactic, same assumption. I met her gaze. "I understand exactly what's happening," I said. For the first time there was a flicker, small, almost invisible, but it was there. Then it was gone. "Enjoy your evening," she said, turning before I could say anything else. She walked back into the crowd, And just like that, she doubled down. That was the moment it locked in. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't confusion. This was a decision. And she had made it. Which meant from this point forward, everything she did, every instruction, every event, would be measured against something she could no longer claim she didn't know. I stood there for a second longer, listening to the noise fill the space around me. Then I picked up my phone and sent Rachel one more message. They're proceeding, full event, no slowdown. The reply came back faster this time. Good. Keep documenting. Don't engage. I locked the phone and slipped it back into my pocket. Because that was the strategy. Not confrontation. Not correction. Documentation. Let them speak. Let them act. Let them commit. And when the moment came, let the record answer for them. I looked out across the hall one more time. Everything was in motion now. No hesitation, no doubt. No one pulling back. Which meant when this finally stopped, it wouldn't be quiet. And it wouldn't be easy to explain. Because every step they were taking tonight was being added to a record that wasn't going to forget. And when someone finally asked them to justify it, there wouldn't be a story strong enough to replace what the documents were about to prove. The event didn't slow down. If anything, it gained momentum. By early evening, the house was full, voices layered across the halls, music threading through the rooms, staff moving in practiced patterns. Glasses were refilled before they emptied. Conversations picked up before they dropped. From the outside, it looked like success. Inside, it looked the same. That was the problem. Because everything about it was working. I stood near the edge of the ballroom, just outside the main cluster of guests, watching the flow. People laughed, leaned in, exchanged business cards. A donor at the center of the room raised a glass, thanking Victoria for preserving something rare. Preserving. That word again. I shifted my attention to the table beside me. Programs, neatly stacked. I picked one up and flipped through it, scanning the language. Greyhaven Estate, a shared legacy. Maintained by Kingsley Ridge Association. Supporting continued community access. Not one line claimed ownership outright. They didn't have to. They were doing something more effective. They were implying it. I folded the program back and set it down. That's when my phone buzzed. Rachel. Check your email, the message read. I stepped out of the ballroom and into the hallway, pulling it up. Multiple attachments. Subject lines from the HOA, internal communications, forwarded, time-stamped. I opened the first one. Board discussion thread. A member had asked, "Are we clear on ownership after the transfer?" Victoria's reply came 3 messages later. "We cannot create uncertainty before donor commitments are finalized." I read it again. Not denial. Not confirmation. Avoidance. Strategic. I opened the next attachment. Another thread. Vendor coordination. Someone flagged a concern about access disputes. Victoria again. Continue operations as planned. Messaging remains consistent. Messaging remains consistent. I looked up slowly, back toward the ballroom. Consistent messaging. That's what this was. Not confusion. Control. I opened the third attachment. Meeting summary. Notes from a closed board session. One line circled. Pausing events risks loss of community confidence. There it was. Not legal confidence. Community confidence. That's what they were protecting. Not ownership. Perception. I leaned against the wall, phone still in hand, letting the pieces settle. They knew. Not just Victoria. The board. The organizers. At least some of them. They'd seen the questions. They'd heard the concerns, and they'd made a decision anyway. Keep going. I stepped back into the ballroom. Nothing had changed. Same music, same movement, same confidence. Only now the ground underneath it felt different, because the illusion wasn't accidental anymore. It was managed. I moved toward the side of the room where a small group of vendors had gathered near the service entrance. Quiet conversation, low voices. I caught the tail end of one sentence. "I thought there was some issue with ownership." Another voice responded. "They said it's being handled." Handled. That word again. I stepped closer. "Who told you that?" I asked. They turned. A man in a catering jacket answered. "Coordinator," he said. "Said everything's cleared." "Did you get that in writing?" He hesitated. "No," he admitted. "Just instructions." Instructions. That's all they had. Instructions from people who didn't own the property. And now, after notice, after documented notice, they were still following them. That mattered. "Appreciate it," I said. I stepped away before the conversation could shift, because the point wasn't to convince them. It was to confirm the pattern. And the pattern was solid now. They'd been told. They'd been warned. And they'd chosen to proceed. I moved back toward the foyer. Near the entrance, the same security supervisor I'd spoken to earlier stood watching the flow of guests. He glanced at me as I approached. "Still going," he said quietly. "Yeah." He shifted his stance slightly. "I checked with my office," he added. "They got the notice too." "And?" He looked toward the ballroom. "They told us to stay unless instructed otherwise." "By who?" He didn't answer right away. Then he gave a small shake of his head. "HOA. Of course." I nodded once. "Appreciate you telling me." He gave a short nod in return. That was another piece. Even after notice, even after confirmation, they were still choosing the HOA's version. Because it was easier. Because it kept things moving. Because stopping would force questions nobody wanted to answer. I stepped outside again, just long enough to clear the noise. The driveway was full now, cars parked tight along the edge, lights on, engines cold, people inside. And all of it, every piece of it, connected to what was happening in that house. Money, reputation, trust. All built on a version of the truth that wasn't holding up anymore. I pulled my phone out and opened the message thread with Rachel again. "They know," I typed, "and they're continuing." The reply came back almost immediately. "Good. That changes liability." I read it once, then again. Changes liability. That was the shift. Earlier, this was a dispute. Now, it was exposure. I looked back toward the house. Through the windows, I could see movement, shadows crossing light, figures shifting from room to room. Everything still working. Everything still smooth. But underneath it, every step now carried weight, because they weren't just acting. They were committing. And once you commit after being told the truth, there's no stepping back from it. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and headed inside. Victoria was near the center of the room again, speaking to a group of donors, confident, steady, unmoved. But now I knew something she didn't, or maybe something she refused to acknowledge. This wasn't just about whether she believed she had authority. It was about whether she could defend it. And the moment that question got asked, not by me, not by a vendor, but by someone who required an answer backed by law, everything she'd built tonight would be measured against something that didn't bend, didn't adjust, didn't care about perception. Only fact. And facts don't negotiate. They don't soften. They don't repeat themselves until they sound true. They just sit there, waiting, until someone is forced to face them. And when that happens, there's only one direction things go, and it isn't the one Victoria Hargrove was counting on. I stepped out onto the side terrace just long enough to get clear of the noise again. Inside, the reception was running like a machine. Smooth, efficient, profitable. That was the word that finally fit. Profitable. Because the more I watched it, the less it looked like a community event, and the more it looked like revenue. I pulled my phone out and reopened Rachel's email attachments, scrolling past the internal messages I'd already read until I reached the financial summaries she'd included at the bottom. Kingsley Ridge Preservation Fund. I opened the first file. Monthly breakdowns, operating costs, line items stacked cleanly down the page, landscaping contracts, insurance increases, deferred maintenance, all rising. Then I saw it. Reserve balance. Lower than expected. I scrolled further. Projected shortfall. Highlighted. That was the pressure. I opened the next document. Event projections. Revenue forecasts tied to scheduled functions. Founders' reception. Highlighted again. Projected donor contributions. Venue-related income. Ticketed access tiers. All dependent on one thing. Greyhaven. I leaned back against the stone railing, looking through the glass doors into the ballroom where people were raising glasses under a ceiling they believed belonged to the HOA. It didn't. But financially, they were acting like it did. I opened the final attachment. Board planning notes. One section stood out immediately. Primary fundraising activities require continued access to Greyhaven Estate. Require. Not prefer. Require. That was the shift. This wasn't about maintaining tradition. It was about maintaining income. And once income is involved, people don't step back easily. They push forward, even when they shouldn't. I locked the phone and slipped it back into my pocket. Then I went back inside. The noise hit again immediately. Conversation, laughter, the soft hum of a room convinced everything was exactly as it should be. I moved along the edge of the space, not drawing attention, just watching. A donor stood near the center speaking with Victoria. "I'm glad you kept this going," he said. "Would have been a shame to lose access." Victoria smiled. "We've worked hard to preserve it," she replied. Preserve, not operate, not profit from. Preserve. The language stayed careful, because the truth underneath it wasn't. I shifted my focus to a smaller group near the bar, 2 board members speaking quietly, not aware I was within earshot. "We can't afford to pause," one of them said. "I know," the other replied. "But if this turns—" "It won't," the first cut in. "Not tonight." Not tonight. That was the line. They weren't denying the risk. They were managing it, delaying it, because stopping now meant losing control, losing money, losing position. And Victoria? She had built her reputation on delivering results. Events like this, fundraising like this, success like this. If Greyhaven disappeared from that equation, so did everything tied to it. I stepped away before they noticed me. The pattern was complete now. Not confusion, not assumption. Incentive. That was what was driving everything. And once incentive is involved, truth becomes secondary. I moved back toward the foyer where guests were arriving in smaller waves now, the peak of the evening settling into steady flow. Near the entrance, I spotted a man I hadn't seen before. Mid-60s, well-dressed, holding a folder and scanning the room with a different kind of attention. Not social, evaluative. He caught my eye. "Excuse me," he said, stepping closer. "Do you know who I speak to about venue insurance verification?" That was new. Who are you with? I asked. Regional underwriting, he said. We insure several events for Kingsley Ridge. Insurance. That was one of the notices Rachel had sent. You get a letter earlier today? I asked. He paused. About ownership? Yeah. He looked down at his folder, then back up at me. I did, he said carefully. That's why I'm here. There it was, outside scrutiny, not a vendor, not a guest, someone who needed answers. Then you should probably speak with the board, I said. He nodded slowly. I plan to. He didn't move right away. Instead, he studied me for a second longer. You're the one who sent the notice, aren't you? I'm the one who owns the property, I said. That landed. Not loud, not dramatic, just fact. He glanced past me into the ballroom where Victoria was still working the room, then back to me. This could complicate things, he said. It already has, I replied. He gave a short nod and walked toward the center of the room. I watched him go. That was another shift. Not internal anymore. External. People who didn't rely on the HOA's version of events. People who needed verification. People who asked questions that couldn't be answered with brochures. I stepped back toward the wall, letting the room move around me. Across the space, I saw the insurance rep approach Victoria. Watched her smile tighten just slightly as he introduced himself. Watched the conversation begin. Didn't need to hear it. I already knew how it would go. Questions. Careful answers. Deflection. Because she couldn't confirm ownership, and she couldn't deny the notice, which meant she was stuck in between. And that's where pressure builds. I turned slightly, scanning the rest of the room. Guests still talking, staff still moving, everything still functioning. But underneath it, something had shifted. Not visible yet, not obvious, but real. The first thread had been pulled, and once that happens, it doesn't stop. Because now it wasn't just me holding documents. Now there were others asking for them, others comparing what they were told against what they could prove. I took one last look across the room. Victoria still standing there, still composed, still in control, at least on the surface. But now she wasn't just managing an event. She was managing exposure. And exposure doesn't go away. It spreads, especially when money is involved. Because once people realize their decisions are tied to something uncertain, they start asking questions. And when those questions start, the story doesn't hold the same way anymore. I pushed off the wall and walked toward the library again, the folder still closed in my hand. Not needed yet, but ready. Because the next step wasn't building the case anymore. That part was done. The next step was letting it surface. And once it did, everything tied to Greyhaven wouldn't just be questioned. It would be tested. And when that test came, there wouldn't be room for interpretation. Only proof. And proof doesn't care who's been telling the story. Only who can back it up. And Victoria Hargrove, for all her control, her confidence, her perfectly managed narrative, was about to find out exactly what happens when the money depends on something that was never hers to begin with. By the time the sun dropped behind the ridge, Greyhaven didn't look like a private estate anymore. It looked like proof. Lights warmed the stone walls from the outside. Music drifted through the open doors. Inside, the chandelier in the main hall cast a steady glow over polished floors and pressed suits, over conversations that felt confident because no one in the room had reason to doubt them. That was the final layer. Not just activity, not just organization. Belief. I stood just off the main entry, watching as another group stepped inside, well-dressed, relaxed, smiling like they were arriving somewhere familiar. Beautiful place, one of them said quietly. Victoria's done a great job with it, another replied. I didn't move, didn't correct them, because at this point, the truth wasn't something you explained. It was something you let surface. Across the room, Victoria Hargrove was exactly where she needed to be, center of the conversation, hands moving lightly as she spoke, shifting from one group to another without losing rhythm. She wasn't reacting. She wasn't adjusting. She was operating, like nothing had changed, like the notices didn't exist, like the questions weren't already starting to move through the room. That was the confidence she'd built this on. And for a while, it worked. I moved along the wall, keeping distance, letting the event continue without interruption. The insurance representative I'd seen earlier was now speaking with one of the board members, folder open, tone quieter than before. Not urgent, but not casual either. That was how it started. Small, controlled, contained. Until it wasn't. Near the staircase, I spotted the security supervisor again. He caught my eye briefly, then glanced toward the ballroom, then back at me. No words, just awareness. People were noticing. Not everything. But enough. I stepped into the library again. The donor lounge, full now. Conversations low, deliberate. A couple reviewing documents. Another guest pointing toward the architectural details in the ceiling, explaining something about restoration work that hadn't been done by the HOA at all. Details didn't matter to them. Only the narrative. I set my folder down on the edge of the table again, unopened. Still not time. Because timing wasn't about urgency. It was about alignment. Everything had to be in place. Everyone had to be present. The story had to reach its peak before it could break. I stepped back out into the hall. The event had settled into its rhythm. Drinks circulating, dinner preparations underway, guests comfortable. That was when I saw it. Victoria turning toward me, not noticing me, looking for me. There's a difference. She moved through the room directly this time, not weaving through conversations, not stopping to greet anyone along the way. Straight line. Decision made. She stopped a few feet away, closer than before. This wasn't a polite exchange. This was a correction. Mr. Whitlock, she said, voice controlled but firmer now, we've allowed you to remain this evening as a courtesy. Allowed. That word again. But I need to be clear, she continued. Your presence is becoming disruptive. I didn't respond right away. Let the silence sit between us. Let a few nearby conversations quiet just enough to hear the shift in tone. Then I spoke. I haven't interrupted anything, I said. That's not the point, she replied. Of course it wasn't. The point was control, and she was starting to feel it slip. This is a scheduled HOA function, she continued. We have obligations to our guests, our donors, and your board, I said quietly. That stopped her half a second. Not long, but enough. Her expression tightened, just slightly. You've made your position known, she said. We've reviewed your claims. Claims, not records. Claims. And? I asked. She held my gaze. We disagree. There it was. Not uncertainty, not confusion, rejection, not of the facts, of the outcome. I nodded once. That's your decision, I said. It is, she replied. We stood there for a moment, not arguing, not escalating, just two positions that couldn't exist in the same space for much longer. She broke the silence first. I'm going to ask you again to step away from operational areas, she said. If you have concerns, you can address them through proper channels. Proper channels. I almost smiled. I already have HOA, that flicker again. Faster this time. Because she knew, or at least she suspected. But she didn't ask, didn't push, because asking meant acknowledging, and acknowledging meant risk. Instead, she stepped back. "Enjoy your evening," she said. Same words as before, different weight. She turned and walked away, and this time she didn't look back. I stayed where I was for a second longer, then shifted my attention to the front doors. Movement there. 2 figures stepping inside. Not guests. Not vendors. Uniforms. Deputy Lucas Hale stepped through the doorway first, scanning the room with the kind of calm that comes from knowing you're not here to escalate. You're here to verify. Behind him, another deputy followed, quieter, watching the same details. They weren't rushing. They weren't reacting. They were observing. And just like that, the room changed. Not loudly, not all at once, but enough. Conversations dipped slightly. Movement slowed just a fraction, because authority had entered the space. Real authority. Not implied, not repeated, documented. I didn't move toward them, didn't signal, didn't interrupt, because this wasn't my moment to speak. This was the moment where everything that had been said, done, implied, and ignored would finally be measured. Deputy Hale paused near the entry table, picking up one of the printed programs, reading it, processing it. Then he looked up, not at me, at the room, at the setup, at the scale of what was happening. Then his gaze settled on Victoria, and the moment that followed. Didn't need an announcement, didn't need a raised voice, because everyone in that room understood something had just shifted. Not perception, not narrative, authority. And once that shift happens, there's no going back to the version of the story that came before it. Only forward, into whatever the truth was about to reveal. Deputy Lucas Hale didn't rush. That was the first thing I noticed. He didn't cut through the crowd or raise his voice. He moved the way someone does when they already understand that whatever they're walking into isn't about urgency, it's about clarity. He stopped just inside the foyer, taking in the room, the signage, the setup, the number of people involved. Then his eyes landed on Victoria. "Ma'am," he said, calm, direct. "We received a call regarding a property dispute." Victoria stepped toward him immediately, the shift in her posture subtle but precise. Shoulders squared, voice measured. "Yes, Deputy," she said. "We have an individual here who is refusing to leave HOA-controlled property." There it was. Not hesitation, not caution, a direct claim. I stayed where I was, didn't interrupt, didn't correct. Because this wasn't my moment to argue. This was the moment the story got tested. Deputy Hale nodded once, then glanced past her. "Sir?" he said, looking at me. "You're the one who called?" "I am," I replied. He stepped closer, closing the distance just enough to keep the conversation contained but visible. "What's your claim?" he asked. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I walked back into the library, picked up the folder from the table, and returned to the foyer. Every movement in the room slowed as I stepped back into view. Not because I was forcing it, because people were watching. That's what happens when something shifts from assumption to verification. I stopped a few feet from the deputy and opened the folder. "Certified deed," I said, placing it on the table near the entry. "Recorded with the county. Property registered under my name." Deputy Hale stepped forward and picked it up. Not quickly, carefully. He flipped through the pages, eyes moving line by line. Then he looked up at Victoria. "Do you have documentation showing HOA ownership?" he asked. She didn't hesitate. "We have board authorization and long-standing community use," she said. "This has been a recognized HOA facility for years." Recognized, not recorded. Deputy Hale didn't respond to the explanation. He just held out his hand. "Do you have a deed?" he asked. That was the question. Simple, direct, unavoidable. Victoria didn't answer immediately this time. Instead, she gestured to one of the board members, who stepped forward with a folder of his own. He opened it and handed over a stack of documents. Resolutions, printed statements, event approvals. Deputy Hale took them, flipped through them, then set them down beside my deed. "These aren't ownership records," he said. "They establish authority," the board member replied. "They establish internal decisions," Hale corrected. "Not property ownership." The difference landed. Not loudly, but clearly. A few guests had stepped closer now, drawn in by the shift in tone. The room wasn't silent, but it wasn't normal anymore either. It was listening. Victoria stepped forward again. "Deputy, this is a civil matter," she said. "We've operated here for years without issue." "That may be," Hale replied. "But I need to establish who owns the property." He tapped the deed. "This document shows ownership." Then he tapped the HOA paperwork. "These do not." The contrast was visible now. Physical, on the table. No interpretation needed. Just two sets of paper. One that proved something. One that suggested it. A voice from the crowd spoke up. "What about the easement?" someone asked. Heads turned. Deputy Hale looked back at me. "Do you have documentation on that?" he asked. I reached into the folder again and pulled out the survey and the termination agreement. "Utility easement," I said, placing the map down. "Eastern boundary only. Maintenance access. Nothing else." He reviewed it. Then the termination clause. "Temporary license ended at transfer of ownership," he read aloud. There it was. The missing piece. Not hidden. Not complicated. Just ignored. Victoria's expression tightened. "You're interpreting that narrowly," she said. "I'm reading it directly," Hale replied. He turned the document slightly, making it visible to her. "The language is clear." She didn't respond, because there wasn't anything to respond with. The room shifted again. Guests closer now. Conversations stopped entirely. The event still existed, but it wasn't functioning anymore. It was being evaluated. Deputy Hale straightened, holding the deed in one hand. "Based on the documentation provided," he said, voice steady, "this property is owned by Mr. Whitlock." No emphasis. No theatrics. Just fact. Then he looked at Victoria. And without a recorded ownership interest or active agreement, the HOA does not have authority to operate here. That was the break. Not loud, not explosive, but final, because once it was said, there was no version of the story that could replace it. Victoria held her ground for a second longer. Then she spoke. "This isn't over," she said. No one responded, because it didn't need a response. The sheriff stepped in a moment later, Warren Cole, quiet, deliberate, confirming what had already been established. Same review, same conclusion. "Event needs to shut down," he said. "Guests will need to clear out." That was it. No escalation, no force, just instruction backed by authority. The reaction came in waves. First confusion, then realization, then silence. Guests began gathering their things. Staff paused, unsure, then started packing up. Vendors exchanged looks, some frustrated, some relieved, because now they had an answer, and more importantly, they had proof. Victoria didn't move immediately. She stood there looking at the table where the documents still lay. Her documents. My deed. Two different versions of reality. Only one that held up. She finally turned and walked away. No announcement. No correction. No attempt to reclaim the narrative. Because there wasn't one left, I stayed where I was, watching the room empty slowly. Not satisfaction, not victory, just the quiet shift that happens when something built on assumption meets something built on fact. The house returned to itself in pieces, tables cleared, lights dimmed, voices gone. And at the center of it all, the same structure, the same walls, the same ownership that had never changed. Only now, everyone knew it, and there was nothing left to argue about. Because when the question finally got asked, and the answer was placed on the table, the story didn't matter anymore. Only the truth did. And the truth had already been decided long before anyone walked through that door. The last of the cars left Greyhaven just after 10. No music, no announcements, no closing remarks. Just engines turning over and headlights pulling away one by one, like something had ended without anyone quite saying it out loud. Inside, the house was quiet again. Not the same quiet as the morning. This one carried weight. I stood in the foyer for a moment, looking at the space the way it had been just hours earlier. Tables filled, people talking, a version of reality moving forward like it couldn't be stopped. Now all that was left were small traces, a forgotten program on the table, a chair slightly out of place, the faint smell of food that had never fully settled. I walked into the library. The serving table was gone. The glassware had been cleared. My architectural drawing was still where I'd put it, untouched. That mattered more than anything else in the room, because it meant something had finally stopped. Not paused, not redirected. Stopped. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Rachel. "It's done," I answered. "For tonight," she said. That distinction mattered. "Sheriff confirmed ownership," I said. "They shut it down." "I figured they would," she replied. "Once the deed's on the table, there's not much room left to argue." "No," I said. "There isn't." There was a pause on the line. "Next part starts tomorrow," she added. I already knew what she meant. Tonight was exposure. Tomorrow was consequence. "They collected money," I said. "Tickets, donations, vendor contracts." "I've already started pulling that thread," she replied. "Once we file, they'll have to account for all of it." That was the part nobody in that room had been thinking about. Not the guests, not the vendors, and maybe not even Victoria. Because it's one thing to believe you have authority. It's another to operate on it, to charge for it, to build an entire system around it. That's where things change. "Board knew," I said. "At least some of them." "I saw the emails," Rachel replied. "That's going to matter." It would. Because intent is what separates a mistake from something else. And tonight, they crossed that line. "I'll come by in the morning," she said. "We'll go through everything in person." "Sounds good." I hung up and slipped the phone back into my pocket. Then I walked through the house again, room by room, not checking, not searching, just confirming. Ballroom empty, greenhouse dark, hallways still. Greyhaven had returned to itself. No signage, no guests, no version of the story left standing inside it, only the structure and the truth attached to it. The next few weeks didn't move as fast as that night. They moved the way things do when they enter the legal system. Steady, precise, unavoidable. Rachel filed for an injunction first. Simple request, clear language, no HOA representation of Greyhaven as community property, no event scheduling, no financial activity tied to it. The judge didn't take long. Records were clean. Ownership was verified. The order came through exactly the way Rachel said it would. Immediate, enforceable, final. Then came the part that mattered to everyone else. Money. Not the number. the accountability. Every ticket sold, every donation accepted, every vendor paid or contracted. All of it had to be traced, documented, explained. The HOA issued a statement first, carefully worded. Misunderstanding regarding property access. Commitment to resolving concerns. Temporary suspension of events. It didn't hold, because the documents didn't support it. The audit did the rest. Outside review, independent. Numbers pulled apart line by line, not opinions, records, same principle as the deed. And just like that, the story shifted again. Residents started asking questions. Not quietly, not privately, publicly, at meetings, through emails, through the same channels the HOA had used to build the narrative in the first place. What did we pay for? Who approved this? Why weren't we told? Those questions don't go away once they start. They multiply. Because once trust breaks, everything connected to it gets examined. Victoria didn't last long after that. No dramatic exit, no public confrontation, just a vote, board meeting, recorded, transparent, removal from position, ineligible for re-election. The same system she'd used to build control. Replaced her. That was the part most people missed. It wasn't personal. It was structural. Because when authority isn't backed by verification, it doesn't hold. It just lasts until someone checks it. The signs came down next. Everywhere. Website updated, flyers removed, social posts deleted or corrected, and then a letter. Sent to every resident in Kingsley Ridge. Not a summary. Not a statement. A correction. Clear language. Ownership clarified. Events acknowledged. Refund process outlined. That was the final piece. Because the truth doesn't just replace the story. It has to travel the same way the story did. House to house. Person to person. Until there's nothing left to misunderstand. Back at Greyhaven, things moved slower. Deliberately. Vendors returned, this time scheduled, authorized, documented. No confusion, no assumption, just process. I replaced the temporary banner at the gate with something permanent. Bronze. Simple. Private property. Access by permission only. No explanation. No emphasis. Just fact. The kind that doesn't need to be repeated, because it's already recorded. I stood there for a while after it was installed, looking out across the drive where the cars had lined up that night. It looked the same. Same stone, same trees, same space. Only difference was, now nobody was confusing it for something it wasn't. That's how it ends most of the time. Not with a fight, not with a speech. With clarity and the quiet that comes after it. Because in the end, it was never about raising my voice or proving someone wrong in the moment. It was about something simpler than that. Letting the truth show up and giving it enough space to stand on its own. Because once it does, there's nothing left to argue about and no story strong enough to take its place.
What this taught me is simple, and it's something a lot of folks don't realize until they're forced to face it. Ownership isn't about who shows up the loudest or who's been there the longest. It's about what's written down, recorded, and backed by proof. And sometimes the strongest thing you can do isn't fight harder, it's stay steady, guard your thoughts, and let the truth speak when it's time. There's a kind of quiet strength in that. Standing your ground without raising your voice, letting patience do the heavy lifting. Because in the long run, truth doesn't need help being louder. It just needs the chance to be seen. If you ever deal with something like this, neighbors, an HOA, or anyone trying to tell you what's yours and what isn't, go ahead and rub a yes down in the comments. I read every one of them, and I know a lot of folks out there have stories just like this. And if you believe in standing your ground the right way, calm, steady, and backed by truth, consider subscribing. There's more stories like this ahead, and I see you in the next one.